So the second half I want to raise, this is a tentative of what I want to discuss with you because we haven't written the paper yet, but I want to raise some problems with the formulation. Recall the formulation, that's the additive separable form. And what is wrong with this problem, at least to me, has been the following. It has no place for the self. Sidgwick is pretty explicit. If you read him, he regarded the notions of the universal good and individual good as essentially similar, and held that just as the good of the person is constructed by comparison and integration of the different goods of each moment as they follow one another in time, so the universal good is constructed by comparison and integration of goods of the many individuals. He took the relations of the parts to the whole and to each other to be analogous to each other, being founded on the aggregate principle of utility. My point isn't really to, I'm not an expert on Sidgwick, but if you stare at the formulation, standard formulation, 1 and 2, you have a problem. At least one can have a problem. And it may be something which can, the problem may be the source of a difficulty that many of us have had with, say, revealed preference approach to eliciting delta and eta out of consumer expenditure, as Nordhaus has tried to do, as to whether there may be problems in doing that in the sense of it may misdirect the investigator about the true intentions of people who are actually doing the savings. I'll make that clear in the next 10 minutes or so. So the problem here is, let's look at the discrete version. What is the unit of time? If the unit of time is a generation, imagine the generations follow one another, so there's no overlap. Overlapping will introduce some notational complication, but nothing conceptual will happen. So I'll be thinking of non-overlapping. Person is replaced by his or her child, and so forth. Suppose the unit is the length of a generation. Then these actions, say the utilitarianism is saying that you're essentially adding generations utilities. And in the Koopman's case, it would be that the units, the utility sequences, each element of the sequence is a generations utility. Okay? And then the problem arises is that when you do any economics with it, the interval of a generation remains a black box. You won't know what's going on inside it because that's the unit. So if the unit is less than a generation, then we do have, at least one can argue, there is a problem here because there's no place for an individual, for the person. So suppose I say that, look, so far as my life is concerned, it's my business, how I treat my life. I'm impatient for early experiences over later experiences. But that's my business. Of course, if I then follow this route, I will be making that same decision regarding my child's and my grandchild's and so forth, because each person is essentially nothing but a flow of utilities. There is no individual character underlying a person's life. And you might then argue that, all right, it's all very well for you to say you can treat your own life any way you like, say discount at 3%, following Nordhaus, let's say, or 5%, who cares? That's your business. But why do you want to, you have no business to discount at that rate for the lifetime welfare of your child who is not yet born? That's the argument. That could be an argument. So the question is, can we reconcile the demands of Sidgwick? And I'm now going to be very Sidgwick-like this afternoon, so that I don't want to meddle the different discount rates all over the place. So imagine we are subscribed to Sidgwick, read Sidgwick, but reinterpret it as the units being each generation's utility, welfare. Lifetime, I'm going to call it lifetime welfare. So we add lifetime welfares, but the way the lifetime welfare is computed is based on the desires and aspirations of the individuals concerned. Okay? And that may involve discounting, if that's what the person chooses. So I'm going to work through some exercises with that. Here we are. So the formulation, so this is what I've just now said. One can argue that the choices the person makes so as to give shape to her life is a personal matter, something over which no meddling ethicist should have a say. How much should I save for my children involves normative reasoning that differs from the one that's pertinent when the same person asks, how should I spread out my consumption over time? The first question involves a combination of affection and morality, a person's treatment of her children and indirectly her subsequent descendants, whereas the latter involves ethics that is directed at a conception of an integrated life. The conception of intergenerational well-being embodied in equation 1 has no place for the self living through time. That's the point. So the question is, how do we model it? And I'm going to give you a simple formulation that Eric and I have constructed, and we'll see how. I should say the Phelps-Pollack route has no place for this analysis of the self because each unit of time in their formulation is a generation. So again, we have a black box problem. So here's the model. And I want to work through it. There's some interesting features that crop up, and then I want to construct a macroeconomy out of it. I'm going to look at dynastic model. So there'll be a single dynasty. An individual has inherited a certain amount of capital asset from his parents, I guess. And he has read his Sidgwick, but he's also feels that it's not Sidgwick's business to tell him how to lead his life. So he has a welfare function which includes his descendants in a Sidgwick-like manner. And then what I want, we'll solve that problem in the simple case that we've already looked at, and it has some interesting features. And we will then construct a macroeconomy out of it. And I'll sketch it because we won't have time to do the detail, but I could leave it as an exercise for you. I'll bet at Oxford, every one of you will be able to solve it. So here's the problem. Let CT be the forecast of the dynasty. We've got a single dynasty now. Dynasty's consumption rate at T, and let delta positive be the rate of impatience people display toward their own future felicities, that they use, that is. Call the person who will be born at date IT, I goes from 0, 1, these are integers, person IT, capital T. Capital T is the longevity of each person, duration of a person's life. So we are imagining that a person is born, lives for capital T years, is replaced by a child who then lives for capital T years, and so forth. Okay? So the transition dates are I capital T, I going from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. All right? The lifetime well-being of person IT is denoted by VIT, and that's equation 7. So it starts at, he's born at IT, lives till I plus 1t, UCT, e to the minus delta. Remember, it's t minus IT because you're discounting back to the date of his birth. So that will be the lifetime well-being or welfare of the person. And if WIT denotes the dynasty's well-being at IT, then what this person will be doing following Sidgwick is to add his and his descendants' lifetime well-beings without any discounting. Okay? And of course, that's this double summation and an integral because time is continuous, just to remind you. So that's it. This is just a description of what I've done. This is the formulation.
So Partha, how do you, going back to the equation, one more, where do you start thinking about the welfare of your children?
At the date you were born.
At the date you were born. And you discount, you internalize their discount rate.
Yeah, you respect their discount rates because you know they're going to be like you.
Okay.
That's the setup here. And they will be discounting. But the discounting for my descendant, third descendant, my child, will be, say, 70 years from now, 35 years from now, let's say, right? What I will not do is to discount his lifetime welfare, recognizing, though, that he will be discounting his utilities during his lifetime. So my ingredients are these objects, and I'm summing over these objects. That's the second. Yeah.
And just to remind us, I'm not sure, is this for a descriptive positive, from a descriptive positive perspective, or from a normative perspective?
Good question. I'm playing it both ends here. In the following sense, I'm asking the following question. Suppose you subscribe to something like classical utilitarianism, but recognize that individuals have a right to their own lives. Then you could interpret classical utilitarianism as saying that it's really the lifetime welfares which should be added. That's one way of doing it, which is all I'm doing here. But what happens within the black box of a person's life is something that the moralist should have no say over. Okay, so that's the idea. Yes?
If
fact that you're maximizing this, like each generation is impatient, but there's a lot of evidence that their revealed preferences show impatience, but that individuals actually regret their impatient decisions just after the fact. So doesn't that
Right.
I'm
Yeah, here I'm not going into that issue, that whether there's regret or not. Here I'm assuming that there is no regret. People are fully confident about how they want to lead their life. They respect the fact that future generations are going to be discounting their own lifetime welfares, and they want to accumulate in a way which protects the interests of future generations, and therefore they do not wish to discount. That's it. That's simple as that.
I appreciate that, but just in general, do you think that people are impatient intrinsically, or that they are impatient without regret?
I'm not an expert on the deep psychology. I would not know. I would not dispute that we often regret doing what we have done. But some of that regret may be owing not to impatience, but things turning out to be bad. Unpredictability can cause it. So it's John.
It does seem odd to me for these sorts of reasons. You're suggesting that when we judge how good a person's life is, we should give more weight to the beginning of the life than the end of the life. Now, and this is what we should do when we're planning how we're going to lead resources for our children's future. I mean, doesn't that intuitively seem odd to you in the first place? Well, I must say that when I read philosophers about this, they mostly think that the end of the life counts more than the beginning, and they think that a life, for a given amount of well-being, they think if it comes as a result of the life getting better rather than as the life getting worse, then that's better. So it's certainly against the intuitions of a lot of the people that I meet. And also the argument for it seems to me unsatisfactory. You describe it as people's impatience. Now, what does impatience mean? It seems to be a sort of thing that I would count as weakness. You know, we are inclined to go for the near good rather than the greater good out of weakness, and it's true that we are. So this isn't telling anything about how we judge the value of our life or anything of that sort.
I think that's very fair.
And if we want to be liberal, well, let people do it. So I'm not, you know, you said we should, it's people's own business how they run their lives. So there's no question of wanting to interfere with people's running their lives. But when we're trying to value how good their
Fair
lives
enough.
are, that's a different
I think that's very fair. I'm going to take the former route. That's the one I'm taking. That is, the personal life is one's business, and the delta is reflecting a preference for early experience to delayed experience. That's all.
Okay, so there are two things mixed up in there. One is whether preferences over levels of consumption or possibly also over changes in consumption. And that, I think, is conceptually completely separate from time preference. And that, I think, is well modeled by preference-dependent preferences in the style of Kahneman and Tversky. As far as I know, nobody has ever thought of these issues in that term yet.
But I think John is quite right. I should have perhaps not talked in terms of impatient. It's a private assessment at the time that a person's making decisions.
Can I just say something about this? So these are forward-looking assessments that you're talking about. It's a person at each time in her life tends to prefer getting stuff soon rather than getting stuff later in her life. And what you're doing is you're thinking that we're going to create a value of her life for aggregating these preferences we've got. But for symmetry, you ought to take account of her backward-looking preferences as well. I mean, it's only her forward-looking ones that determines how she acts, but if you're trying to get an idea of how good her life is and you want to base it on her own preferences, the backward-looking ones count, so you should worry about it.
Quite right. So let me give this the form of an account of how consumption would proceed, how savings behavior would be generated when each decision maker has a intertemporal welfare function of this form. Okay, let me state it that way.
Just one last point on this.
Yeah.
Just that from a positive point of view, there needs to be some kind of discount in order to account for the savings behavior that we observe and whatnot.
We'll see about that later.
But to a certain extent, I mean, you can have agents who live, let's say, in these overlapping generations, while something like agents who live 2 periods don't discount their personal future at all, actually, but savings performed simply because of these assets that live through time,
Yes.
and future generations who end up buying them, right? So one way of modeling something like that, where across one person's black box generation, consumption is valued equally across time, is to simply say that, well, that is the case, we're all the same, and the fact that we observe positively the saving that goes on is an artifact of the fact that we don't live in independent generations and the assets live through time.
That's right. But you see, the motivation for saving is somewhat different here from that, because there it's entirely instrumental. Instrumental in the sense that, you know, you're going to be out of action and you need somebody else to produce for you.
I feel it's more reasonable than a representatively infinitely lived agent, but
Well, this is not one. This is not
But isn't the problem here that this argument is our intuitions are driven by the fact that most of us only have access to our human capital, which we get a stream of going on into the future. We don't have access to our markets, so we can't, in fact, we can't spread our consumption evenly. So we're all constrained early in life about our levels of consumption. So we see people being impatient for this reason. This is purely accidental. This is purely the way the market for human capital works. If we actually could, in fact, shift our consumption.
You may well be right actually, but my motivation for looking at this structure is not that. Sure.
This echoes a few of the points. First of all, the valuation of consumption according to the evaluation criteria will be as sorted. But I'm not quite sure what's going on with deaths here.
We haven't solved the problem at all. I haven't looked at the feasible set. Let me.
No, I'm not talking about the path of consumption. The weight put on.
Oh, right, yes, indeed, absolutely, yeah.
And I think another point, and it links in a way to the area of completeness, is one reason for discounting is uncertainty about whether one is going to be around
Sure.
to enjoy the felicity
Sure.
in 20 years' time.
Yes.
And law of large numbers, that might net out for society, but if you're an individual, then you
Sure.
can't.
Sure.
And that's not exactly impatience.
No. All right, let me eradicate the word impatience from this, because it's causing unnecessary problems. I'm not committed to that language. It's the language I borrowed from Will Nordhaus's, because I was trying to explain how it could be that if you do reveal preference on short-term savings behavior, you may get a high delta, even though those same people, if you ask them, they say, oh, of course I care about my children. What do you think I am, some kind of a jerk? So that's the motivation behind this.
All the people who are still here are not impatient, so...
Okay, here we go. So I'm going to work with the usual model, eta greater than 1. And so now let me write down some equations, because they are the ones which are relevant. So we have you're interested in maximizing, by choice of CT, this object, I plus 1 times t, u of c t e to the minus delta t minus it dt. That's the setup. Subject to my linear technology, rkt minus ct. Okay, k not given. That's the setup. I'll write down the optimality equations. The second of the equations is what's of some interest to, should be of some interest to you. But the first one is straightforward. If g is the growth rate in consumption, then that's equal to r minus delta upon e for all t not equal to it. I goes from 1, 2, and so forth. So during the lifetime of a person, of an individual in this dynasty, we follow the Ramsey rule for obvious reasons. It's a smooth case, discounting at delta, and you get the Ramsey. This is the Ramsey equation, which we've already seen, but not at the transition points, because that's where the switch comes. So long you're discounting is different. So you need a second condition, which is smoothing the auxiliary variables. They have to be continuous. So that gives us, and I'm going to use the general formulation for U, although here I've used the isoelastic form. I'm going to switch from the general to the particular as I go along. It's U prime C T. I made a mistake already. So write by T minus, as T approaches capital T from the left, and T plus, a similar thing when you approach it from the right. Then U prime of C I plus 1, T minus 1, e to the minus delta I plus 1, T minus 1, minus, should equal U prime C I plus 1, T plus. That's the key, this equation. It says that, it's saying, if that's violated, you see, you would wish to reallocate. When I say we, I mean the decision maker would wish to reallocate consumption across the transition points. The point is that take this person who is Mr. I. And for Mr. I, and it doesn't matter whether it's he who's making the decision. By the way, this the formulation here, I'm sure you've noticed, it's this is intertemporally consistent. There's no time inconsistency in this. So it doesn't matter who's making the decision. All right? So I want to set up the story by saying it starts at date 0, we call him person 0 person, he's inherited K naught, and he's solving for his dynastics. The solution has the property that for each generation, the consumption, in this case, I'll be thinking, by the way, I should do these details I keep on forgetting to do, but they are important. We suppose R is greater than delta and eta is greater than 1. This will ensure that the problem has a solution. Okay. Basically what happens is this sufficiently productive, the economy is sufficiently productive that consumption will go towards infinity fast enough to, and remember the utility is bounded above, so we don't have it. It's a trick that Frank Ramsey used to be just repeating it. So that's the setup. Consumption grows for each generation. R is greater than delta. It grows at a rate less than R, of course, but it's growing. But at each transition date, there is a discontinuity in consumption.
Sorry, what is a transition date?
When a person dies and is replaced, IT, I times capital T, and I goes from 1.
And people not dying every period?
No, each person lives for T periods, or T years, not periods, I've got continuous time. So you're to imagine that people live for T years and are replaced by a descendant, and then the descendant is replaced by his descendant, and so forth and so on. All right? That's the setup. So the generations are numbered, but time is continuous. Okay?
So would this discontinuity be perfectly smooth by on certain lifetimes if they were dispersed enough?
No, I don't think so. I haven't done that, but my guess is no, because there is a discrete discontinuity arising out of the delta, which is unrelated to any notion of uncertainty. So, but unless by fluke the uncertainty cancels it off, it won't. I can't imagine what it would be, though. That would cancel it off. Okay. So that's the setup. Is that all right? This is saying that, let's say the ith generation, he's going to be, he'll die at I plus 1 times T. Right. So, yeah, he was born at IT, he'll die at I plus 1 T. So as he's approaching his end, is of course the consumption is, his utility is being discounted at delta. Right. So this is his marginal utility of consumption as t goes to his last period. And the marginal utility of consumption of his descendant at his birth is, of course, the latter. And these two should be equal, because if not, then a reallocation would improve matters. That's the setup. Because he's not discounting his child's utility, remember, at the date of birth.
He's placing himself at the date where
That's right.
descendants.
So when you move from the left, you're discounting a delta. When you move from the right, you're not.
So that C would have to be higher than that C.
Yes, exactly. So you have a gap. So here is the diagram to show you. You can then show that the consumption rises at each date, each transition point by let me just see now. What's the So you can show that it's C t plus divided by C t minus. And I can put an I here, by the way, it doesn't matter. Homotheticity of the utility function and preferences and linearity means that it will be the same ratio of jumps is equal to e to the delta t raised. That's it. So that's right, that's the jump. So, John, the consumption path is, I plot t here, it's increased in log. Suppose I'll take the log of consumption. Then it's t, 2t, and so forth. That's the setup. Okay. That's what this is telling us. If you feed in the isoelastic utility function, play around with this, and then use this as the growth rate per within generation, then you're going to get this equation. Okay? Notice this formulation reduces to two extreme cases. If t equal to 0, capital T is 0, gives you which case? It gives you the Frank-Ramsey model. If capital T were 0. It's treating each individual as essentially a sequence of momentary U's. And if t is equal to infinity, you get the infinite, the lived individual. Capital T is equal to infinity. So both have been studied, of course. But this is an intermediate case. Now, I'm going to not go through, sorry.
Can I ask
you? Yes, please.
But then the growth of consumption across generation will be higher than the growth.
Yes, absolutely. So the growth rate within a generation is r minus delta upon eta, but the average growth rate, of course, is.
Is that consistent with the model?
Well, that's for empiricists to tell me. The problem is, that's a very good point. I don't know. I have no idea what I want to do is, of course, the discontinuity is a bit worrisome, right? So you're looking at macroeconomic data. Question is, how do you handle that? So I'm not going to work through the model because it's calculations are nothing but calculations, and that's very boring. I want to give you the idea behind it. It's a natural one to think about. Suppose I now construct a staggered set of continuum of dynasties. I mean, I'm sure you can guess what I'm going to do. Imagine that you've got a continuum of dynasties. In fact, capital T dynasties. And I can normalize by saying population 1 upon T, so there's only one person in the economy, but it's continuum. And they're staggered so that each dynasty is reflecting the path. So for 0 to T is a set of dynasties of density 1 upon T. So that we don't have to worry about. Talking about a number of dynasties. And a dynasty member who is born capital A years before the person you're studying will have inherited the capital asset stock that this person has inherited. But of course, he'll be solving his problem, so at the time at date t equal to 0, his capital asset will have grown. So the way to think about it would be, the way we think about it, it's a way of solving it, is to say that when you inherit, let's say this person has been born and he's inherited capital, K0. He breaks this up into two components, one for his private purposes, P for private, personal, and a bequest that he sets aside. This he puts in a bank, earning rate of interest R, of course. That's the rate of return in the economy. And that amount is what his child is going to inherit when the child is born. This bit he spends on himself. That's where the delta kicks in. And that's a straightforward problem to solve. It's a finite time horizon problem with a boundary condition saying that I want my capital asset to deplete to zero when I die. This bit. All right? So you get this hump-shaped savings behavior. But of course, this is telling me that consumption rises exponentially. And the last date, this has been depleted to zero. Kp at capital T is zero. But of course, this has grown at the rate R per unit. So it'll be whatever this was, the Kb of 0 becomes Kb0 e to the R capital T, which is what the initial, the inheritance of the child, who then repeats that exercise. He doesn't have to. He's actually following the rule established by his father. And all the generations will be just looking up the book and saying, well, how much do I save? Or how much should my bequest be? Homotheticity and linearity means that this will be a constant ratio, independent of the inheritance. So what we need to do is to calculate the fraction that you leave aside as bequest, the fraction that you leave for yourself. The amount that you leave for yourself, keep for yourself rather, you use up on the basis of a discount rate delta, because that's your life. Okay? And so now what you do is that story you tell for every generation. Now you look at the continuum of dynasties. And then, of course, at any date, aggregate consumption is going to be the sum of consumption across all the dynasties who are alive, which is, of course, all the dynasties from 0 to capital T. At any moment, there's only one transition dynasty. Hence, the aggregate will not pick up the discontinuity. Your aggregate consumption will be rising at this rate, at the rate R minus delta upon eta, which is why you might think, if you look at the data and then think that actually what these dynasties are doing or what this economy is solving is the Koopmans problem with no self put in it, you would infer that it's a positive delta. And that was one reason I was interested in exploring this, because here you have a motivation which is not positive for the long run, for the future. Because if you look into the far future, let's say you're looking at 15th generation down the road, and you're looking at the third year of the 15th generation. Then, of course, you're discounting only for 3 years of that person's life because you want to respect his irrationality or whatever. All right? But beyond that, you don't discount. And this suggests that discount rate is perhaps the wrong thing for us to study. What we should be studying is what economists would always tell you you should be studying, which is the shadow price of consumption, discount factor. And because we should be interested in that, because that's valuing consumption in the future relative to consumption today, which is the thing that counts. Discount rate, because we are used to these exponential discounting, we move from one to the other seamlessly. But the moment you puncture that, the key thing is discount factor. And when you look at the discount factor, then you can see that in this formulation, the deep future is going to get the same weight of the margin, approximately, as it is today. Because the deep future, most of that distance, time distance, is undiscounted. You're only going to be discounting the lifetime during the lifetime of the person who is. So now, if you can then do, I've basically given you all this, the whole thing, but the rest is all math. I mean, just calculations, which are rather boring. Yeah, you have a question.
Is the dynastic welfare being maximized by the 0th person, or is it a social planner who's doing it?
Well, I'll get into trouble if I give you an unambiguous answer. So I'm going to give you an ambiguous answer. If we're in this sort of dynastic mold, we're looking at ethically minded or concerned parents. And the solution to this problem will be followed by the descendants of this person. But you raised a very important point, and here's why. I think I'll try and relate it to the concerns. I've embedded this, I mean, I haven't done the maths, but you can see how it's really quite trivial. It's just very boring. You're embedding this household, this dynasty, in a world with many other dynasties. Okay. Now, if the dynasties are all in step, then it doesn't teach us anything, because just looking at one is enough, and you're going to get this unfortunate or unpleasant discontinuity, which that the economy, the model postulates. So what you do is you stagger the dynasties. So at any moment of time, you've got a person of each age. But of course, they all belong to different dynasties. So there'll be somebody who's just born, somebody who's only 1 minute old, 2 minutes old, 3 minutes old, but they all belong to different dynasties, okay? Embed them in a stationary state in the sense that each generation, each dynasty is just staggered version of any other dynasty, okay? So that's all easy to do. The math becomes very simple. Now, in this world where there's only one capital asset, and it's a private good, the reason I've introduced other dynasties is simply to get a macroeconomy out of it. And the reason I'm interested in getting a macroeconomy out of it is because of this feature. And I've smoothened this away. The aggregate data won't show this because I've got these staggered. But now you're saying, well, who is the maximizer? In this story, it's each dynasty is doing its own maximization because they're completely independent of each other. There's no interaction between them. There's no need for it. Now that should tell us something that maybe, I'm going to try this out and see whether you find this plausible. Maybe, if we think that people do care a lot about their children, grandchildren, and by recursion grandchildren, the way John Vickers was suggesting earlier, as I do, and let's suppose I could arrive at this through a recursive form. I've just postulated as the welfare function, but you could do it as a recursive form by saying, well, the recursion is over lifetime welfares, and then peer into the lifetime, and then you see the weakness of the person, each of us, with a positive data, and you respect that, so you embed this. So that's the story. Now, it could be that if we think that we're approximately that type, that is to say, we care about our children, and in some ways we have to, it seems to me that the savings rates that we have observed, after all, we have become very rich compared. Where did all that savings come from? And who was doing the savings? And why were they doing it? You get into a real mess out there, right? I mean, you're getting answers to that. But suppose that just as a ballpark figure, this is not a bad way of thinking about dynastic savings behavior. Then it suggests that what we should be really concerned about in the climate change problem is not about discounting, because people are far-sighted anyway, but they should be concerned about the fact that we're looking at a global commons. And that is a different problem altogether. And that we should be concerned about it because we haven't sorted out the collective action problem that's involved in solving the global commons problem, which is like a public good problem. It's equivalent to a public good problem. It's the other side of the coin. And that because now if you think of the nations as being dynasties, quote unquote, at least the leaders pretend that that's what it is, because they said, from my country I represent my, okay, so let's take that as a first. Then we have non-identical dynasties, and we should be studying a bargaining problem. And maybe that's what's at the heart of the climate change discussion. That it's a bargaining problem if everybody wants to be a free rider. And my former student, Scott Barrett, who has done some outstanding work in this field, really outstanding, because he opened up this bargaining theory in a non-cooperative bargaining theory. make the point, which is now generally understood amongst game theorists and appreciated, is that you wouldn't, in an asymmetric model, you would not expect all countries to be included. There will be some countries, and you have multiple solutions to these bargaining problems, by the way, depending on how the negotiations were designed. And, well, you've got a world expert here who will tell us about that. Then maybe the weakness of the treaties was in insisting that everybody be a signatory. And but this is an aside. It's not what I'm really concerned with here. But this is trying to tell me something about the possibility that we should be instead concentrating on the public goods nature of the problem rather than the discounting, because you would look as though people, if the public goods problem or the common property resource problem is unresolved, then there will be excessive use of the commons, even although each dynasty is actually far-sighted. This is a point I was trying to raise yesterday, or somewhere, I think at lunch, that what might look as though myopia may be a reflection of non-myopic people facing a commons problem, an unresolved commons problem, an unmanaged commons. Okay, John.
I agree very much with what you just said, but I think the problem is just a little bit worse than it's an ordinary commons problem. Because what seems to happen in the international negotiations is not that people have got to make binding commitments, and that way then everybody would be happy so long as they were binding. It's that people think the current generation has to make sacrifices for the sake of future generations, and that's the conclusion that comes out of the Stern Review, even out of Nordhaus. If you do the optimization using some discount rate or other, the outcome of the optimization is that the current generation has got to consume less, make sacrifices. And it seems to me that that's actually a bigger problem than the commons problem. You're not going to get nations to agree to make sacrifices on behalf of or to agree to make their citizens sacrifice. And so I think it's actually more important for the people to realise this is an externalities problem, which means that people can be made better off without anyone being made. So sacrifice is not actually required on the part of the current generation. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because it is true that we could remove this externality without the current generation making a sacrifice, but only by transfers from future generations to the current generation, which will involve loans. So what's going to happen is that the current generation has got to be taxed or whatever it is with carbon. They can be compensated for paying the tax, but the money to compensate them some of it will have to come from loans that future generations have got to pay. And we're told you can't borrow. This is what seems to be the view these days, that there's a limit to what governments can borrow, and we've hit it. In which case it means that this Pareto improvement, which is good for everybody, isn't available because of this unfortunate feature that the financial markets won't allow the loans. And I don't believe it. I believe that this is a job for economists, is to make it feasible for the financial markets, through the fact that for governments to borrow more, so as to make a Pareto improvement actually possible. And if it becomes possible, then I hope that the commons problem has a better chance of being overcome.
Share with you.
Any other questions?
See you, Ahmed.
So,
No, go ahead. No, sorry.
Even to the commons problem, which is obviously a bargaining situation, there still is the possibility of figuring out the first best at the end of the day. And so when we have these various staggered dynasties, what would you say the objective for the first best should be? Because you said you don't want to get in trouble, you want to leave it there, because, but ultimately, let's say that we're going to leave the bargaining to the game theorists. What is the first best, as in with what yardstick do you measure out the first best if you have various concurrent or possibly staggered dynasties, countries, nations?
Well, you're right in pointing out, but it will be very similar to what Professor Broom has just now said, what you will do is, in the feasible set, you will plug in a public good, let's say, just for the sake of argument. Think of it as a public goods problem. Instead of a single private capital good, you have a public good, which is affecting the utilities of all generations. So U of C. Dynasties will be U of C of that dynasty, comma, G, or some notation for the public good, H, let's say, H of T. And then the production set will have the feature of whether there's an undersupply of the public good or not. Of course, the commons problem is just the mirror image of it, but mathematics is very similar. You can solve for the first best, but the first best will now require of you to give a different weight to different dynasties, to give a weight to the dynasties, because now the dynasties are affecting each other. You see, in this model, the dynasties don't need to speak to one another, because I'm only concerned with, want to set up the welfare function for the dynasty. Now, suppose you want to work with this welfare function for the dynasty. Now you have to get the dynasty to talk to one another because of the commons, or the public good. That's entering into every individual's utility function. And then you can solve for the first best. So pretend now there's not a bargaining problem, there is a super authority who's solving it. Solve for that.
I'm just wondering about the linear combination that you then use at the end of the day. If every dynasty equally weighted, not equally weighted. I guess the moment you provide the link, obviously they're just not autarkic, and so you have to make a transfer between dynasties.
There is totally no reason to follow the modeling device that Eric and I are following now for the pure private good case. If you have a public good, then I think you should go for broke and have dynasties of different sizes, different capital assets, to try and mimic the fact that nations are of different size and population. And then you come up with problems of the conventional kind. What weighted system do you do? But you can still, in principle, work out what all the northeastern points are by solving for, then you have weights, and you vary the weights across the dynasties, or across the nations now, let's now call it the nations, and track the northeast frontier from the non-cooperative outcome. The non-cooperative outcome will be a bit similar to the one we've already done here, because there would be no agreement on that.
Yeah, it's a slightly similar point. The T's might differ quite a lot between different members of different dynasties. So, for example, there might be some that look like different adaptations, like the Oxford College might be an example of something expects to be around in thousands of time, years time. Some other things in the economy might have very short horizon. So there's quite you've got all these different.
Yeah, well, Sidgwick had it easy, because if you regard a person or an entity to be nothing but a sequence of utils, then it doesn't matter how long they live, you're just adding up anyway. I'm creating difficulties here, of course. You're quite right. And if you have different lifespans, then your delta is going to be operating over different distances. Yeah. But somehow I can't help thinking that's a smaller order of magnitude problem than the others we're discussing here. But anyway, this is the framework. This is one framework in embedding individual concerns with the universal concern, if you like, if you want to put it in a dramatic kind of way. Yes, sir?
Just a benchmark model. If you had a Sidgwickian evaluation function, what would be the optimal solution given your structure of dynasties? And
oh, here, I've given it. This is it. This is the Sidgwickian, because the future generations are not being discounted. You see, their lifetime welfares are not being discounted. This formulation has that property. You see, this is cancelling off the fact that delta minus delta. Yeah, this is it. This is what you're doing is here is following the spirit of Sidgwick by saying it's lifetime welfares which need to be added. And now you peer into the lifetime, and I'm discounting there. That's all that's. And this is the solution. But this is a solution where, in a world with private capital only, so the dynasties are not interacting, you see. The only reason I'm introducing different dynasties is to soften this discontinuity to nothing. So the macroeconomic data will look like macroeconomic data. But it's an interesting empirical question. The trouble is, you see, it's hard to know how is to interpret when the jump takes place. Because if you have overlapping generations, but you'll still have a jump, by the way, even if you have overlapping generations because of this treatment.
Can I ask a question on this? It seems still quite non-intuitive to me why people should optimally choose to leave an optimal consumption to the next generation, which is higher than what I had in the last period of my life.
Right.
So why?
So the way you want to think about it, it's a variational argument. It's saying consider a consumption sequence or consumption plan, and you want to equalize the discounted marginal utility.
I see where the mathematics come
Yeah.
from, but the intuitive part is still.
Well, that is the intuitive part.
Okay, yeah.
But because because if this were greater, suppose the left-hand side were greater than the right-hand side.
Let's put it another way. It doesn't seem realistic to me that I would like my children to have a higher consumption than what I had in the last period of my life.
No, but you have to think of it from the point of view of the whole lifetime. I mean, you could have linear increasing, but then you yourself would do better tilting your own path. And so would your children.
And you've already done that.
Okay,
And you've already done that tilting.
So,
Yeah, okay. Actually,
Well, it's striking how far this is from. I mean, yesterday we had sustainability was merely dw by dt.
That's right.
Non-negative.
Yes.
This is whoa.
This is, but I'm doing policy analysis.
Yes, I understand, but I have sympathy with the last comment.
So do, by the way, so do I.
My
So,
point was about sawtooth was just on the weights on consumption at doing that,
yeah.
and that's precisely what gives rise to.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. You're quite right. This is. You're right. What you were doing is, yes, I was looking at the dynastic welfare, and you're saying no. You should be looking at the utilities at different moments in time, and you're giving it very different. You're getting a sawtooth kind of. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are trying to embody two types of reasoning in one model, and that's what it happened. And it's. Well, my son, who is a philosopher, told me that, I must stop thinking that an integrated life is the integral of life. So he rightly says that these linear operators are missing out on the notion of an integrated life, that maybe linearity is the wrong thing. But integrals are easy to operate with because we've got mathematical machinery. Nonlinear operators are a mess. So that's why I haven't, but I believe him. I think when one thinks of a lifetime in the way that John was urging us to think, reflecting into what will it be like when I look back on my life and so forth, they lead to evaluations which are really not picked up by this framework. That's for sure. I couldn't agree.
well, what is the argument for additive separability of these things? I mean, I think Lucas and Stokey, in another context, proposed that we start trying to do without that, not for normative reasons, but presumably for positive reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, do your ethical intuitions really give you a reason for additive separability across generations?
The trouble is that the ethical intuition turns out to be the mathematical intuition, which is marginal rates of substitution should be independent between any two dates should be independent of other dates. usual arguments. The question is that plausible, reasonable? Yes, John.
Since it's come up, when somebody suggested you should be thinking about different lengths of life, you said you thought that might be a comparatively minor problem. But I think that actually it's a theoretical level a really rather big problem, because at that point it becomes impossible to believe in separability of times. If you think that it's a good thing to live a longer life, and you want to capture that in your value function, it's going to be impossible to evaluate the world just by looking at one at times, one after another, but which is sort of really an essential assumption if you're going to do practical economics. I mean, that's what economists do. They look at how good a time is by aggregating across people at the time, and then they aggregate across times. And that implies...
You could do it additive but multiplied by a survival probability.
I've tried it. It doesn't work.
What doesn't work?
There are things you can try and do to overcome this problem, but so far as I know, I haven't found a satisfactory way of making an additively separable function that properly takes account of the value of extended life.
Of an extended life.
You know, maybe I haven't, and it is done. And anything you can do is think of ways of doing it. So what you've got to do is somehow take account of the length of life that a person has ahead of her as a feature of her well-being at
that date.
time. You've got to do that.
It doesn't.
And I think that's what John was suggesting. And all I can say is I've tried it and I couldn't get it to work.
What's wrong
It
with
is
the
possible
RE
to do
69,
that.
RE stat? I mean,
Sorry?
what's wrong with the RE's uncertain lifetimes paper? Thinking about choices that shift the distribution of lifetimes seems to me doesn't have anything obvious. But we can talk about
I
this
think
over
you need
lunch.
to explain more about that.
Okay.
So Yari's, it's an interesting point. The Yari's paper was doing what? What did Mami do?
Basically, adapted this sort of dynamic framework to accommodate uncertain lifetimes in what seemed to me like the first way you would think of.
You're going to have to tell me that.
I mean, the basic idea is that when you're dead, you don't get any utility. When you're alive, hopefully you do, and that gives you the trade-off across, different distributions of data.
Oh, so this is lifetime welfare, 0 to t, but t is random, so it's expected value of that integral.
Oh yeah,
That's the argument. Yeah.
we can aggregate across lifetime well-beings. That's fine, but it won't give us additive separability across times.
No, that's an
Okay, so
assumption.
you
That's an
can't
assumption.
value times
Yeah.
independently of each other.
So that's an
But that's in practice what we have to do. We look at a particular time in the future, we think of what's the consumption at that time, and we try to do our valuation of history that way. The separability across times route.
Yeah.
And I think that isn't going to work if we care about longer lives. As adding across people, that is the right way to do it. Yeah. And okay, you can't have both sorts of separability at the same time. Separability across people and across times.
So we're coming to the point where we should give Partha a chance to have a coda. And then break for lunch.
No, this conversation is much more interesting. Because there are, as you all can see, there's a huge number of unresolved issues. And I think one reason I wanted to take the second part of the morning on this is to wean ourselves away from a straitjacketed model. And all the debates have been about the delta, the elasticity, but in a framework which I think there's so many ways of opening up that model. And actually, we've just now had a discussion. If you value the remaining number of years of your life, then you have, as you say, U of C, then T minus T, capital T minus T. T is the date at which you are doing the evaluation.
Yeah. So let's take another question if anybody has. Then failing that, we're going to break for an hour, and we'll be back with Professor Sir Robert Watson at 1:30.